We're going to look at question 5 in paper 1 section A. This is worth 22 marks, so it's really important that you do it well. The first thing then is don't run out of time. Every year when I look at mocks and every year in the examiner's report, there are so many students that run out of time because you're so focused on question 4 on the text that you do know and the transactional writing task, and maybe you spent too long on questions 1, 2 and 3, and you run out of time for what's a really important question. And it's a difficult one as well because you've got to compare two texts. So if anything, maybe it's the hardest part of the whole paper, but you've got to do it well. And if you approach it in the way that I'm suggesting now, you will be able to do it well. You've just got to take it step by step. You need to look, the next thing is that you need to look beyond obvious superficial comparisons. If you look at the November 2020 examiner report, for instance, it says this: at the lower end, candidates tended to make obvious comparisons. Often these responses became narrative, sometimes with greater emphasis on one text leading to a lack of balance. Candidates at this level were generally able to draw links between the writer's ideas and make some straightforward comments. Some candidates copied out overlong quotations. The other thing that they suggest is that doing a little bit of planning would be useful, and actually just spending a little bit of time thinking, how am I going to compare these two texts? What have I got as an interesting comparison? Otherwise, you will just warble. Okay, you'll just say, well, this text says this text says that, this text writes about this text writes about that, and you're just going to be dealing with very trivial, superficial things. You need to be finding juicy, interesting ways of comparing the texts. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples of how you can do that now. First of all, though, what the examiner is looking for is some clear comparative paragraphs. Okay, now I've suggested you write maybe about 5 decent, really good comparative paragraphs. You might have time for more, you might only have time for 4, I don't know, but make it really clear. Just thinking, right, I've got one way in which I'm going to compare the texts here, and I'm going to write a paragraph about it. And then I'm going to leave a line blank and do my next way in which I'm comparing the texts. Just make it clear for the examiner, this aspect of comparison has finished. Now I'm going to start a new way in which I'm comparing them. And just believe me, just making it easy for the examiner to think, here's one comparison, here's another comparison, here's another comparison. It really does make their life so much easier. For each comparison that you're making, you obviously need to talk about both texts. And for each, you need a quote from each text in each paragraph. You'll see an example of that in a moment. You also need to talk about the effect on the reader. What did it make the reader think or feel or picture? What response does it get from the reader? You need to try to deal with a range of different comparisons within your whole answer. So maybe one paragraph could be focused on the descriptive techniques that the writer uses. Another paragraph could be dealing with the thoughts and the feelings of the narrator. Another paragraph could be mainly focused on aspects of language or on aspects of structure. But you need to deal with a range of different ways in which you can compare these texts. This is your opportunity to show off. So aim for about 5 decent paragraphs. You need to allow at least 35 minutes for this question. Maybe a bit longer if you've got the opportunity. Here are some of the ways. This isn't exhaustive. You might have other ways in which you can compare, but here are some examples of the ways in which you can compare the texts, I think. First of all, how do they begin? Do they begin by launching straight into the action, or do they set the scene? Is there an element of orientation, of describing the scene and the characters before they launch straight into the action? How do they end? Do they end on a cliffhanger? Do they end with a climax? Do they end by linking back to the beginning? How are the settings described? And are there similar techniques like sensory description or similes and adjectives used to describe the settings? How do the writers present the events or action? Do they present them as being quite tense or quite chaotic? And if so, how do they use language to do that? How do the writers, particularly if it's written in the first person, how do they present themselves and their own feelings and thoughts and response to incidents and characters? How do the writer's attitudes compare? Do they both feel conflicted? Do they both feel confident about something? Do they both feel a sense of regret or a sense of anger or a sense of pride? So how could we deal with the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions and the attitudes, and then how the language in both texts is used to present those? Are there similar or contrasting characters described? Maybe you've got two characters, one in each text, and maybe they're described in quite similar ways or in very different ways, and what techniques are used to describe them? Is there a similar or contrasting tone or mood or atmosphere? Maybe you can find two bits, one in each text, and they're both really tense, or in both there's a lot of humour, or in both there's a sense of relief, or in both there's a real sense of peace and tranquility. Yeah. So look for the moments of tension, look for the pivotal moments, look for the significant, the crucial moments, the moments where things switch or things change, the moments where it's a really crucial, important moment within the story, within the narrative. How do both texts use particular techniques? So if you've got a couple of an example of a simile or a metaphor or some sensory description from the two texts, give some examples and then explain how and why they're used. What kind of description is, what kind of setting or character is being described here. How and why do both texts use factual information or statistics? Often a lot of these texts are based on experiences of people traveling to different places, but it's not just telling you stories very often, is it? So it's not just to narrate, but there are sections which are very much to inform, to give you information about the country or the location or the people or the event. From the non-fiction text, you might have learned all about Kibble donkeys and all about rock climbing in canyons and about Bhutan and the history of it. Do you know what I mean? You learn information about the location or about the experience or the event, don't you? How and why do the texts use that information or those statistics or whatever, those facts? Is it because the writers are trying at that moment to present themselves as experts, as knowledgeable writers who have done their research? Is that why that information, why that paragraph is particularly factual? And very often in both texts you'll find a section which just stops telling the story for a bit and presents you with some information, and they would be really good points to say, well, look, these are similar. Okay. What techniques do the writers use to engage the reader, to make them feel involved, to make them feel as if they're present, as if they're there at that moment, to create that sense of immediacy? How do they do that? Yeah, maybe they use sensory description. How do they get you involved and make you feel as if you're there? Now, these are just some examples, okay, but you need to try to have a range of different ways in which you could think, okay, let's look at the ends of the texts. I wonder if I've got something to compare there. What about the moments of tension? What about the moments where there's some really focused description? How could I compare those? And you need to have those questions going through your mind at that planning stage so that you can see some ways in which you can compare. So before you start your answer, you should be thinking, okay, I've got 4, 5, 6 chunks of comparison that I can get stuck into here. And they're your 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, aren't they, for your answer? Here are some examples then. This is me having a go at comparing. This was from a past paper or a sample paper, comparing, you might have looked at it, the ice swimming in Tromsø unseen passage with Between a Rock and a Hard Place. So here are a couple of examples. The first paragraph here, I'm comparing the mood and the tone at the end of the texts. Okay, so I've said this. Structurally, the texts end in contrasting ways in terms of mood and tone. In the final paragraph of Ice Swimming, the mood is one of relief and euphoria when wrapping up following the plunge into the icy water. In contrast, in Between a Rock and a Hard Place, the passage ends with suspense and tension. The writer's arm is still stuck and resisting his desperate attempt at trying to shift it. Words such as anxiety, adrenaline, desperate, and brace emphasize that he's in an extremely dangerous predicament. In contrast, the tone is much more positive in text 1, with references to faintly exciting, endorphin rush, and stimulating. So can you see I'm looking at the idea that one of them ends on quite a positive, or a very positive note, this real sense of relief and positivity and the thrill of what they've been through. The other one ends with a sense of real tension, and shock and horror at what he's facing because his arm is still stuck between the rock and the canyon wall. So there's a very different mood and tone at the end of these two texts. And notice I'm using a comparative connective. I'm using in contrast in order to show that I'm making that comparison between the two. Let's have a look at another one. Again, it's the same two texts. Text 1 uses humour to engage the reader, whereas text 2 is understandably much more serious in tone because of the final outcome of the experience. So notice I've started off by saying one of them uses humour, the other one is much more serious. So I've got a clear comparison in that first sentence of that paragraph, haven't I? The writer creates humour in text 1 by referring, for instance, to the moment of putting one's shoulders under the water as the moment when the wildebeest falls to the lions. The humour here is created by comparing the plunge into the water to a fatal and painful experience, using exaggeration for effect, or hyperbole you could call it. In text 2, in contrast, a comparison is made between the chockstone and a relatable object in the metaphor refrigerator chockstone. Here, however, the comparison is not meant for humorous effect, but to emphasize the sheer size of the stone, so that when later in the text it falls and blocks out the sky, the fear the writer experienced in the moment is highlighted. Now, can you see in each of those paragraphs, from the beginning, I know what I'm comparing. It could be a similarity, it could be a difference, but I've made it really clear what I'm comparing between the two texts. Okay? From each of them, I've used a quote. In fact, I've used more than one quote from each text to exemplify, to explain what I'm talking about. Okay, so I've got to have a quote, for at least one quote from each text here. One is fine, okay, but you might find, like I have, that I pick out another couple as well because they fit in with what I'm saying. You've got to have a clear point of comparison, a quote from each text, and then while you're doing that, explain why you're picking out those quotes and why they're interesting and what they show, and do some analysis. It's your opportunity to show off how good you are at analysing texts. And in fact, it's the only opportunity you get to show how good you are at analysing an unseen text. Because in question 4, you will have analysed the one from the anthology. In questions 1, 2 and 3, unless you've gone wrong, you won't have done any analysis at all, because you're not meant to. There's no analysis of language required, is there, in questions 1, 2 and 3? Okay, it's all kind of pick out the facts. What are the ideas? What are the thoughts? What are the attitudes? What are the points? Okay, there's no analysis required in questions 1, 2 and 3. But here in question 5, you're comparing the texts, yes, but in doing so, you're also showing off along the way how you can analyse an unseen text, okay, alongside one that you're familiar with analysing and talking about the language and the structure. Yeah? Let's have a look at just a couple more examples. I just picked out something from Young and Dyslexic and something from H is for Hawk. And I haven't actually compared it to anything yet, but I'm just showing you how you might be able to if this was the one from the anthology that was picked out. So here's a bit from Young and Dyslexic. I've said, Young and Dyslexic is written in quite a colloquial, informal style at times. For instance, Zephaniah uses slang expressions such as "don't be heavy on yourself" and "we've got it going on." The phrases sound like him speaking directly and personally to us, and therefore engage us as readers. In a similar way, then what you can do is, if you've got the unseen text is also maybe quite chatty and colloquial and personal in terms of its style, look for some examples of contractions. Yeah, words like don't and weave and you'll and it's. Yeah, look for some examples of humour. Look for the examples of slang from the other text, which creates maybe an equally informal tone. Or maybe it's not at all. Maybe it's much more formal and much more detached, in which case you can draw a contrast, can't you? Let's have a look at H is for Hawk. In H is for Hawk, the pivotal moment is when she's at the turning point, the really significant moment, which kind of like, it's the moment that everything hinges on. Okay, The pivotal moment is when she realizes that the bird she has grown attached to is not the one that was intended for her. Her shock at this moment is emphasized by the use of short sentences. It was the wrong bird. This was the younger one, the smaller one. This was not my hawk. And even a single word paragraph with the exclamation "oh" in italics to show her panic and disbelief. In the unseen text, so you need to draw your comparison now. Okay, so you've picked out the pivotal moment in H is for hawk. In the unseen text, the pivotal moment is emphasized by the writer when, and then you're off talking about the pivotal moment in the unseen one. Okay, and there what you need to talk is, well, what does the writer do to draw your attention to that moment, to that pivotal moment in the unseen one? Okay, maybe it's similar things to this one with these short sentences emphasizing a sense of shock. I don't know, it could be anything, couldn't it? But what does the writer do to draw your attention to it, and why is it such a significant moment within the narrative? And then once you've explained that, you finish that comparison, you leave a line blank, and you move on to your next point of comparison. Okay, so there's a lot to think about here. Okay, and throughout the whole of the paper, and we've got 2¼ hours altogether, okay, it does require you to think carefully about timing for each section. Don't spend so long on this that you don't have enough time for the transactional writing, because that's worth 30% of your whole GCSE, isn't it? So you've got to think about the timing for every section of the paper here, all right? But you want to give yourself at least 35 minutes for this question to do it really well. But if you approach it like I'm saying, if you approach it by thinking, how could I compare both texts? Let's find a range of different ways, and for each one have a quote, then launch into your analysis and explore the ways in which they're similar and different in that respect. Then move on to your new paragraph and your new point of comparison. Okay, if you do it like this, you can really impress the examiner and get full marks.